Have you been spending lots of time on Spanish, but still don't feel like it's sticking? Let's go over the two main reasons that your Spanish study isn't turning into fluency. You'll learn how to hack your brain so that Spanish skills can become second nature. This is for you if you're acing your tests, but you can't speak in a natural way on the fly. Or maybe you feel like every time you memorize a new piece of Spanish, you end up forgetting something else. We're gonna fix all of this in the next 10 minutes. Let's start with the biggest reason that some of the hardest working Spanish students can't turn all of that knowledge into fluency. The reason that their Spanish doesn't become natural is because they actually focus too much on memorizing phrases. Now, don't get me wrong, you definitely do have to memorize a lot of Spanish words and grammar to become fluent. But when you're memorizing phrases and scripts word for word, you aren't actually preparing yourself for real-life conversations, which are never gonna follow the script. But this is today's secret. There is a way to prepare for the flexibility of real-life Spanish by creating mental models of Spanish skills. Mental models are what native Spanish speakers use to speak with endless variety, and you can too. Your brain uses mental models all the time to understand the world around you in a flexible way. Here's a really random example. Take a look at this thing that I'm holding. So if you looked at it only from this angle, it basically just looks like a square. Or from this angle, it kind of looks like a square but with a little thing on one side. And then from this angle, it looks like a circle with a little extra thing sticking out. But you know that these aren't three different things. In fact, I'm guessing that if you saw this object from any angle, you would know exactly what it is, a coffee cup. And that's because to your mind, this object is one coherent thing. No matter how you see it, you know that it's a coffee cup, and the different angles don't mean that it's different things. And here's why this is just like learning Spanish. If you try to learn Spanish just by memorizing specific phrases or scripts, it's kind of like only being able to recognize a coffee cup when you see it from one specific angle. But when you have a mental model for how a Spanish phrase works, you can use it in all kinds of different ways, not just one simple scripted way. Let's put this into action in Spanish. So here's a simple example of how you can learn one mental model to do an infinite variety of things. Let's start with a simple sentence. I want you to be here. Quiero que estés aquí. This sentence may look really short and simple, but it actually uses a very important structure with a subjunctive. So if you memorize this exact phrase, that's one thing, but learning how it works will help you create a whole mental model of how to use subjunctives in Spanish. And if you do, you can create a whole bunch of variations, like, I want us to be here. Quiero que estemos aquí. They want me to be here. Quieren que yo esté aquí. She wants her house to be in Barcelona. Quiere que su casa esté en Barcelona. So these sentences express a bunch of different things, but they all use the same mental model of using querer, and then que, and then a subjunctive phrase. And not only will you be able to say all of these things naturally, you'll also be able to understand when someone else says something like this to you. But imagine if you had to memorize every single version of this sentence. That would be kind of like only recognizing a coffee cup from one very specific angle. By having a full mental model of Spanish sentence structures like this, you can use and understand Spanish from all kinds of different angles. Here's another example, and it's a bit more complex. They told something to my sister. Le dijeron algo a mi hermana. So this uses a different model, a different sentence template, and it involves what we call a redundant indirect object, because the word le is redundant with a mi hermana. This happens all the time in Spanish, and native Spanish speakers have no trouble doing this because they have a fully developed mental model of how to do this. Now, there's no way you're ever going to memorize every single sentence you could ever need with a redundant indirect object, so instead, you should focus on practicing this template with a bunch of variations. As you do, this will become more and more flexible until you have a full mental model of this sentence structure. Here are some examples of variations on this sentence. I said something to my friends. Les dije algo a mis amigos. Did you say that to your family? ¿Le dijiste eso a tu familia? She said something to her husband. Le dijo algo a su esposo. Imagine if you could freely use this mental model in all these different ways and also understand these complex sentences when you hear them without even thinking about it. This requires practicing these as mental models, not as scripts. But if you do it enough, eventually you won't even have to think about it. And that's what real fluency looks like. But there's a second reason that your Spanish study isn't turning into natural fluency. And I promise that I'm not trying to guilt trip you here, so please don't unsubscribe when I say this. But here's the hard truth. If you're working really hard on Spanish and still not becoming fluent, it might actually be just because you're not being patient enough. Because if we're being as realistic as possible, mastering Spanish skills takes months of consistent work. And that's because of something called consolidation. You can learn a new Spanish structure and practice it all kinds of different ways, but it won't become second nature just because you're practicing it. You have to practice it consistently over time, which can be frustrating. Here's an analogy for why. Imagine you're building a wall out of bricks and cement mortar. So you put down some mortar, lay some bricks, put down another layer of mortar, put down more bricks, and so on. But if you stack these up too fast, this new wet mortar is not going to hold and the wall's going to collapse. The only way to do it right is to wait for the cement to dry in between layers. Learning Spanish works the same way. It's not just about getting more and more practice, it's also about getting that practice over time. And I'm talking about literal calendar time. So for example, that's why getting 15 hours of good practice spread out over the course of 2 weeks is a lot better than trying to get those 15 hours of practice crammed into one study session. Your brain simply needs time to consolidate all of those skills. It needs to get a little bit of good practice at a time, get some good nights of sleep in between, and continue practicing consistently. So for example, let's say you're practicing with this subjunctive sentence structure from earlier in the video, quiero que estés aquí. And let's say that you're working on using this sentence and lots of variations on it in all kinds of different contexts. For this to become a full mental model, you need to do 2 things. You need to get some good, deep practice with focus and variety, and you need consistency over time. We're talking lots of nights of good sleep in between all that practice. Okay, now it's time to make a plan. Here are 3 tips for structuring your study in a way that will turn all your Spanish into mental models, optimized for natural fluency over time. First of all, start with the essentials. Don't try to memorize certain phrases for specific situations like you would in a travel phrasebook. Instead, focus on the highest frequency words and sentence structures. These words and phrases only require a few mental models, but they're adaptable in literally millions of ways. This is the fastest way to build core fluency. At the end of the video, I'll show where you can go to master the top 100 words and all core Spanish grammar. The second tip is to create a daily routine that gives you productive practice with everything you've learned. Consistency is what'll turn your clunky Spanish into effortless fluency. Even a 10-minute daily routine can make a huge difference if you're practicing effectively. I'm also linking a video here with the daily routine that we recommend for all of our coaching students. And then the third tip is to move forward in thin layers. By starting with that core foundation from tip number 1 and practicing with consistency, that's tip number 2, you can then move forward by adding complexity a little at a time while you reinforce the basics. That way you don't lose any old skills while you move forward with new skills. What you'll notice over time is that the new material will always feel challenging, but it'll be just challenging enough. And then the old material will become second nature, slowly but surely, turning into real mental models that you can use fluently. And that's the secret to fluency. A well-paced, consistent plan that balances the challenge of new skills with the consolidation of old skills. All right, now you have a plan. So it's time to take action and get started. You can kickstart your path to fluency by joining our next Spanish in 1 month challenge. This is a 4-week grammar bootcamp with the daily structure to do everything from this video. Each lesson focuses strictly on essential Spanish mental models. This is a deep dive into the top 100 words which make up 50% of everyday Spanish. We'll build your core skills so that you can master Spanish sentence structure, as well as tricky things like ser versus estar, object pronouns, and subjunctives. The challenge gives you step-by-step guidelines for what to do every single day, so there's no guesswork. You'll get personalized quizzing to help consolidate everything you learn, plus access to our expert native-speaking Spanish coaches to answer all of your questions. You'll also be surrounded by a community of hundreds of other Spanish learners taking the challenge together for support and accountability. Each daily lesson is bite-sized and manageable, always giving you new skills, but balancing them with daily review of everything you've learned. So if you feel like you're stuck, this challenge is your chance to break through to fluency 1 layer at a time. If you're up to the challenge, then use the link in the description to join us.